Well, hello, viewers of the internet world. We find ourselves trudging along through the story of the end times, and here we are just after the opening stages of the Thanquol end times book. And we are going to switch gears and talk about many short things, furry things, and green things over these next couple of chapters. In the den with me today is the philosopher Keith. Please,
hello,
please say a quick word. Let them know you're around.
Hope the evening finds you well. We're going to talk a little bit about battles going on underground today. All very dark and dank and exciting.
Yeah. At this point, we are without our third philosopher, Vince. He is quite likely being swallowed up by a vermin lord with all of the dealings that he's had with the underhandedness of the Skaven. So who knows if he will appear out of the ether at some point later, but we're not counting on it. We've probably lost him forever.
Yeah.
Okay.
Probably deserved it too. Filthy Skaven.
Yeah. So as we said, in the end times, we're jumping around the world a little bit. And we're coming back to the old world now, and focusing in on most specifically Karak Eight Peaks. And I thought it would be worthwhile to give folks a little bit of a general history of Karak Eight Peaks. Well, as the name would suggest, it's a dwarven hold, and an ancient one at that. However, it's not really been a dwarven hold for the last couple of centuries. With the waning of the dwarf strength in their population, it was at one point overrun by goblins, and they have been largely in possession of it for most of that period of time. There's always been efforts by the dwarves to regain control of it, and have occasionally had some footholds, but never could really reestablish themselves. So it's the goblins that are maintaining the surface holds and the shallow caves. But even more recently, the Skaven, under the head of Clan Morse, has occupied all of the deeper, lower down realms of the dwarf hold. And they have, in their respects, renamed it the City of Pillars, obviously because it's, well, full of dwarven pillars. At the time that we take up the story, only just a few years before this, Belagar Ironhammer has actually secured a foothold and has been not really taking a grand control of it, but at least maintaining something of some strength there in Karak Eight Peaks, with the hopes to sweep away eventually all of the Skaven and all of the goblins and take it for himself. So largely we have those small contingent of dwarves wedged between goblins and Skaven. Now, so when we pick up the tale here, I guess the thing that I want to open with is, I hope you like explosions, people, because we're dealing with Skaven, and there will be many, many explosions over here. In fact, one of their opening salvos in this whole tale is that they've sent warlock engineers underneath 4 out of the 8 peaks that make out the Valley of the Kings, that there is, it makes the hold. Now, they've targeted those 4 mountains because it's largely where the greenskins inhabit. And they are trying to plant this so they can subvert any of that greenskin action, because the greenskins are gathering from the Badlands and from the east. Many new tribes are rallying to the flag of Skarsnik, who has called himself the true effigy of Mork, one of the 2 major orc and goblin gods. All right. So, Keith, was there any key moments here in this opening part of the chapter, building up to it, that you want to share?
Well, so from the Skaven point of view, Karak Eight Peaks is kind of the Clan Moore's stomping grounds. It's where the warrior clan, all those kind of clan rats and the Stormvermin, they kind of cut their teeth, and those that survive the kind of trial by fire with the dwarves, those make it into the higher ranks and they move on. So this is the home field advantage, if you like, to Queek Headtaker, who's kind of the general for the Skaven army. But Queek's kind of interesting for Skaven in that he doesn't really care for the intrigue and the backstabbing and stuff. he's just really just straight up for a fight, and he likes nothing more than killing dwarves. And we're certainly in for a lot of that as the chapter goes on. From the dwarf point of view, then, it also makes mention that not only is Karak Eight Peaks under siege, but all of the other dwarf holes are also under siege. And Belagar has received missives from Thorgrim, the High King of the Dwarves, saying, help isn't coming, we're all dealing with our own Skaven invasion. So, whereas before Belagar has been repelling these kind of like sporadical raids from the Skaven, this time the Skaven are gearing up for what they describe in the chapter as a genocide. So you know it's serious.
Yeah, in fact, they spend a lot of time in the opening chapter sort of trying to really, really convince you that there is an endless, endless tide of rats. I mean, there's one scene where Queek is off in the lower deeps inspecting the forces, and he's in this giant cavern standing upon a ledge and looking out over this mile-long entrenchment. Can't see the end of the Skaven ranks that are displayed out there. And it goes on to say that that's only one of 5 similar staging areas that were well deep underneath the city of Pillars where the Skaven were staging. But also at this point, I think it's worth doing a little bit of segue and talking about the Skaven intrigue. It's sort of well known, as you touched on, Queek, that he is the warlord, clan leader, the war chief of Clan Moors. Sort of the second claw of Nodwell. He's the guy that has the seat of Clan Moors on the Council of 13. And it kind of reiterates this a number of times over the chapter that Skaven warlords are always trying to not only bring up warlords to make themselves look better, but always careful about that getting too powerful, because, as is the Skaven way, they're always looking to knock off the guy above and take his strength. So there's always a bit of a suspicion with Queek that Nodwell doesn't actually want him to fully succeed here. But he has been given the instruction directly from Nodwell to take Karak Eight Peaks as quickly as he can, make sure that Clan Moors looks like it's the driving force behind that, so that they can then go to these other dwarf peaks and help the other lesser clans to overtake those, and thus maintain, again, the glory of Clan Moors, keeping in mind that what the hope is if another siege is failing and Clan Moors comes along, well, it's obviously Clan Moors that tips the balance, so they deserve all the credit. But here in this stage, we also meet up with a Grey Seer who Queek has an absolute disdain with. Remember this guy, Keith?
Yeah, this guy, Cranscript. Yeah, so he said Queek hates magic, he hates trickery and all that kind of subtlety stuff. But this Cranscript has managed to insinuate his way into being the leader of the 5th Claw Pack, which is like the crappiest Claw Pack. It's going in first. It's just like the dredges of the slaves and the giant rats and stuff like that. And so Cranscript, though, he's kind of got this little secret ally. So we have a little one of those cutaway scenes, and he's kind of scratching in the ground. And it turns out that Queek's master of spies, an assassin, comes up to him and just kind of says, "Hey, Queek knows you're up to something, but he doesn't know what exactly it is." And then that guy scampers off, and then out of the shadows, a voice appears, and it's of course another vermin lord called Soothnar. Who's got this scrying orb and can see the future, and is kind of taking an interest in Cranscript, who's like a Grey Seer down in his luck, and is going to help him out. But as long as Cranscript stops trying to bind him, so what he's doing is scratching runes into the ground, which I thought was kind of interesting. But yeah, so Cranscript is really just a puppet for this vermin lord, as we'll see throughout the chapter, and he's got this meager position in there, but the presence of Cranscript has alerted to Queek to the possibility that, well, the inevitability, I guess, when you're dealing with Skaven, is that saboteurs and assassins and people looking to take his place are going to be all over the place. So Queek is traveling around, visiting his claw packs, trying to calm some insurrections, And of course, you know, he kills an assassin. He just lops off the head of a couple of his chieftains and manages to avoid a cave-in. And like that's just all in the day of a Skaven warlord. Didn't even bat an eyelid at it.
Yeah, I kind of like that a little bit. How it seems just so aloof, right? It's like, oh, you know, another assassination attempt. You know,
yeah.
Here we go again.
Like it's almost like it would be kind of like insulting if it didn't happen. You know, it's just another day as a warlord. Yeah. But it's important to kind of put this, if I can, for a moment, put it in the perspective of the kind of global Skaven campaign. So this invasion of Karak Eight Peaks, and indeed all of the other sieges of the Dwarf Holds, has been sanctioned by the Council of 13. And our lead up to this chapter is before that moon gets pulled down and before the big invasion of the Lustria. So this is kind of going on simultaneously with the Festilians' invasion of the Lizardman homes.
Yeah, it's good to have an important timing mark there, I guess, so that we can coordinate all those things and those thoughts.
Yeah.
Now, switching to staging, and of course, Queek this to fight, and we just chomp going. But it's been, as you say, because this has been set up by the Council of 13. The major clans who otherwise wouldn't generally work together, they've kind of been forced to. So as I said, these engineers are out there under the guise of Clan Scry, are setting charges underneath the mountains, while the Greenskins are rallying thousands and thousands to come to Karak Eight Peaks, their own, under Skarsnik's banner, as we said. And really all the poor Belagar is able to do here is he knows it's coming. Hey, like his rangers come in and report to him about the Greenskins coming in. The dwarves who are attuned to the rock and the mountain occasionally feel the rumblings from deep underneath and know that there's something going on. What he can do is just sit there and prepare, and a dwarf does. Really the only proactive thing that we can get out of Belagar at this point, central holds to set traps and explosions and hamper the advanceable Skaven assault. So that's really all that Belagar can do at this point until the mountains finally shatter. And this is another one of those big moments in Skaven engineering where, again, nothing is beyond their imagination. We have already touched on in the last chapter how they're trying to draw the moon closer and or eventually blow it up. And it's just like happened. We just got to work hard at it. So here they go, and they assault. They set off the charges in those 4 mountains. And of course, as Skaven engineering goes, the percentage of success is lackluster, but doesn't just go off in a series of charges, a chain reaction, and this signals the beginning of what is going to be a mighty happiness here for the Skaven. So, do you want to take us through the sort of the opening stages of Skaven assault?
Sure. So the first kind of battle kicks off, and we jump to, so the dwarves are held up in this kind of central citadel, and then there's a hall outside of that, and then there's a bunch of like little lesser halls around that, and those are kind of like the choke points that dwarves can hold, because while they're very low in number, they're the elite troops, right? So they're kind of going for a battle of Thermopylae type situation where they can hold up in these choke points, and then so the Skaven numbers don't count for anything. So the battle kicks off, and Queek throws in all the slaves, and all the traps are going off, giant slabs are dropping down, explosions are happening, it's great, and just like countless slaves are dying. And like Queek is just not even bothered by this. So it kind of zooms in as a microcosm on one of these little battles where a dwarf Thane is holding off this one gate. He's got like a handful of iron drakes and a bunch of iron breakers. And so they're they make a shield wall. They're shooting behind the shield wall. Every now and again, they'll push with their shields and push the Skaven back, and so on and so forth. And this goes on for like weeks, and they just can't crack this like little knot of dwarves. But the dwarves are eventually starting to crack, and then it says that in all the other little entrances, dwarves are taking casualties, and like they're really wearing thin because the Skaven are just limitless, numberless. And then so Belagar kind of comes to a decision. He's kind of prompted to this decision for two reasons. And what he does is the doors back to the dwarf citadel open, and a bunch of slayers come through, and that happens all throughout 8 Peaks. And the reason why this happened was because the Skaven wouldn't expect a counterattack, and there's a chance that these slayers might actually kill someone important. And the second reason was, well, Belagar couldn't really stop them anyway. So these slayers were going for their glorious death. And you know, slayers do what they do best. They charge in and they just start wrecking face. But eventually the superior numbers of the Skaven start to tell, and they find their glorious death by being poked by a Skaven slayer. So you can decide how glorious that is. But eventually the outcome for that was the slayers, well, they all died. It bought the dwarf defenders time to retreat back in behind into the next line of defenses. And so how the dwarves are working is that as their perimeter gets smaller, they concentrate their fighters, and so each progressive attack gets harder and harder for the Skaven to penetrate. And as you said earlier, Kieran, Queek needs to take Karak 8 Peaks fast, so he can go then and get to the other 8 Peaks where Nodwell has prepared for his arrival, so that they can effectively sabotage the other Skaven clans, so that Clan Moors can sweep in and save the day. And so the dwarves are denying Queek that. And at this point as well, there's a little bit where one of the war leaders of those 5 claw packs, he kind of shows his hand to Queek that he is in league with Clan Scryer, and also wants to take Queek's place as the war leader of Clan Moors, and Queek just locked his head off.
Yeah, the key point about that, there's 2 things along that way that I think are important. And that is that they spell out that at this point in the siege, it's only the low-quality slaves and maybe a few clan rats that have been exposed to the dwarfs at this point. So none of the quality troops have really come to fore, except for here at this last bit, after the slayers come out and they chase all the low-quality troops away, then they come forward with, finally, for the first time, the storm vermin. And that's where this guy Thrax is. He's one of the claw leaders of a storm vermin pack. And he doesn't press through the gate right away. That's what pisses off Queek so much, is he's not pressing the attack. He's waiting and stewing and waiting for the next signal. And that's kind of when Queek realizes that, you know, he's not really on all 100% for Clan Moors, and challenges him. So that's the key points I took.
At some point as well, and I've forgotten exactly where in the chapter it happens, but Queek receives a counter order essentially from Nodwell saying, no, take your time and grind out the attack, like make it last, instead of trying to end it quickly. And so this kind of further arouses Queek's suspicion that, you know, there's something else going on, and that Nodwell is in fact trying to dispose of Queek rather than wanting him to succeed.
Yeah, and of course he dismisses that because that's not in Queek's best interest. That's not what Queek loves.
Exactly. Queek is not a patient rat.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, so I guess we'll take it up again, turning our attention back to the dwarves for a second. So they eventually retreat into this great hall, the Hall of Clan Scafton, and I might be wrong about this, but I think that Scafton was one of the original settlers of Karak Eight Peaks, and that's why it's such a famous dwarf name in their lineage. But anyway, that's not terribly important. What's important here is that they decide that that's the first place that the collective of what's pretty much all of the rest of the remaining dwarves have drawn back from the outer reaches, and this is the one place that they're going to make a big, great stand. So they stage everything there. All their cannons and organ guns, and they again have trapped this area very heavily for cave-ins and rock falls, explosions, and all kinds of things to hamper the Skaven. But this is also where Belagar finally comes to swing his own hammer in the battle. So again, we have a little bit of staging up here, as with all battles. You know, it's a bit of chaff gets chaffed, stuff gets blasted. Loads and loads of Skaven get filled with quarrels from their dudes, and it looks bad for the Skaven initially, but their superior numbers press through, and then they start to really put it onto all of the dwarfs. There is a stage in the battle where Queek finally reveals himself as well, and this kind of makes the dwarfs go into a little bit of a rage because he's been a thorn in their side for a long time. Queek is very famous with the dwarfs, and once they cite him, that enrages them a little bit further, and it also kind of spurs Belagar on to sort of press forward. And this is, for me, in the storyline, the first time where the dwarves show a little bit of weakness, because they sort of stretch it out and they get exposed, and a bunch of rat ogres flank in on Belagar's hammerer unit. Now, once they're pinned in there, that's when Queek takes his opportunity to spring forward and pin them on the spot. So we get into a little bit of a challenge for the first time of the mighty Queek Headtaker and King Belagar, and they have a lot of hammer swinging going on and dwarf gouging. So much so that they kind of take a toll on one another. But the reason it doesn't come to a conclusion is because Belagar blows, or gets his standard bearer to blow the horn of calling, and the gates behind them open up, and out comes the famous Golfag and his man-eaters with an ogre contingent on his side. And so this for me was a little bit of a wow moment for ogres to show up on the dwarf side. What was your take on this, Keith?
Yeah, it was totally unexpected, and I think it even mentioned earlier on somewhere in the chapter that it was like the greenskins and the ogres kind of populated the top part of Eight Peaks, and so I was kind of like, oh, all right, well, I guess it doesn't make, it's certainly not stretch of the imagination. Mercenaries typically like gold, and dwarves can mine a lot of it, so it was great to see them.
Okay. Just as timely as the ogre mercenaries have come to the dwarf rescue, our third philosopher, Vince Venturella, has come to our rescue to join us. Good day, Vince. Do you have any audio over there? If so, we don't hear you. Anyway, yeah, you're still empty. We're gonna keep talking while you figure it out. So here's what happens. So Golfag comes forward, and it talks a little bit about how the ogres were hired and the desperation that Belagar had at his, he had to turn somewhere. So he struck a deal at an exorbitant amount of gold from Golfag. And Golfag, of course, was so pleased with this, because squeezing a gold piece out of a dwarf is pretty hard. Squeezing piles of gold out of a dwarf is even harder. So he feels pretty proud and chuffed about himself because he's done this. But there's one other quick point that I thought was pretty comical here, and that is that Belagar drew the line at Noblars. He said, there will be no Noblars in my dwarf hold. Absolutely not. Never. No way. And,
Not a green thing.
And then it has this little brief side that says, we don't really know what happened to those Noblars, whether they were sent away, but they were probably eaten by the ogres just to sustain themselves for the battle ahead. And then they went on.
And nobody seemed to mind.
No, nobody minds.
Yeah.
So anyway, back to the scene itself. So those two, Belagar and Queek, are in the challenge, and in comes thundering the ogres, and they're smashing the crap out of the Skaven. And Queek actually has the tactical acumen to recognize that he's in an exposed position, so he'd have to pull back. And so he breaks away. Belagar's wounded. He's wounded. They both break away, and they don't go any further. But then there's another momentous thing that happens right here, and this leads back to the Skaven intrigue and shenanigans, and that is that they famously, Skaven have drilling teams that make their way through there and under the floors, etc., etc. And so they hear rumbles in the bottom of the floor, and in several spots, these drilling teams burst forth, and everybody kind of steps back and pauses and waits to see what comes of them. So maybe I'll pass it back to you, Keith, for a couple minutes if you want to tell us what excitement ensues here and why.
So at this point, the tunnel opens up beneath doors, and out pops a bunch of cave squigs, and they just run rampant through the dwarf and the Skaven lines, followed up by a bunch of night goblin archers, and then Skarsnik himself. And he's called together the mightiest squad that has ever been seen in Karak Eight Peaks. And night goblins and forest goblins on their spiders have come up from the south. Black orcs have come from the Badlands, and orc tribes have all joined in just for this fight. And at this point, Skarsnik is hanging out on a nice precipice, and he's got his little prodder for his squig friend. Starts shooting green lightning, and that's the signal, and it's the signal for the ogres to turn. So they've been just going to town on the Skaven, completely repelling them, and then they turn around and just start whacking the dwarves. And the dwarves just didn't see it coming. Totally taken by surprise that ogres managed to put the hurt on. So at that point, Belagar knows he needs to retreat, but he's getting blocked by goblin tunnels. And there's hell pits running through his lines, and there's ogres, and there's squigs, and, the plan is falling apart. So Queek wants to get back to the dwarves, but he's cut off by the goblins, but he doesn't really mind because he enjoys killing goblins. The ogres make a bid for the artillery hill that was kind of like the anchor point for the dwarves, and they just smash that aside. And then it's at that point that Golifag kind of decides his job is done. He's done enough to play out his bargain with Skarsnik, and he starts looking for his way out, get him and his boys out of there. So at this point, our old pal Cranscript shows up, and he casts the Karak's Call, which makes this giant earthquake chasm split in the middle of the battlefield. And so there's this big shadowy figure behind him, adding his power so it's even more destructive. So, stalactites are crashing down, and massive earthquake, and thousands of warriors are getting swallowed up by this chasm. Belagar's getting out of there, but before he goes, he's got one last surprise, and he blows a bunch of charges that are rigged all along the support pillars along the hall, and it just comes crashing down. So he manages to get away, and a lot of dwarves manage to get away as well. But we don't know the fate of Queek or Skarsnik at this point, but they're slippery characters, so I wouldn't be surprised if they survive.
Slippery they are, yes, always.
Definitely.
Well, so that kind of is where the chapter comes to a close, the way that it's written in the book. Kind of leaving you with that cliffhanger of, well, if the hall just crashed down and all three of these armies all at the same time, well, what becomes of them? So it kind of leaves you with that just wondering moment. So with that, maybe I think what we'll do is we'll leave you folks wondering as well. We're going to come to a close on this chapter, but we'll resume very shortly with Chapter 3 of the End Times. Farewell, everybody.
Good night.
Queek moved with blurring speed, but Belagar anticipated the strikes, moving his shield to counter each. It was Belagar who landed the first blow, an overhand strike from the hammer of Ungrim that cracked Queek's spiked shoulder plate. Both combatants winced, the Skaven from the sheer force of the blow, the dwarf from the feedback that emitted from Queek's warp shard armor. 5 times Queek was sure he'd landed a telling stroke, but each time Belagar shifted his shield in a flash of blue and gold. With nothing but a few scratch marks to show for his efforts, the shrewd Skaven next attempted to draw his opponent into overextending. Queek taunted the dwarf about their previous encounters, speaking of how he'd slain Belagar's brother. The Dwarf King's eyes flickered to the skull with matted beard impaled upon Skaven's back banner. In his growing rage and frustration at being unable to smash his hated foe, Belagar finally made the smallest mistake. And all Queek ever needed was the slightest of openings.
Hey everybody, we are back in the den for some more End Times, this time for Chapter 3 of the Thanquol tale. You know what made me think about just as we were starting into Chapter 3 is I haven't really heard much and we're 3 chapters in. Curious, hey? The book's named after him. Not much action for that guy. Anyway, that's just an aside. We're full force philosophers here. So Vince and Keith, please give a wave and say
evening, everybody.
Whatever friendly things you'd like to say.
Hello, viewers.
Okay, well, we're going to pick up Chapter 3, and we're still in Karak Eight Peaks at this point. We've just left the last chapter with a momentous battle between not only the Skaven and the dwarfs, but the goblins have intervened with Skarsnik. But then the halls came crashing down, and the pillars were tumbling, and we're kind of left with the thought that, you know, that could have crushed all 3 of these armies all in one place. But we'll have to read on to see about that. Where we pick up this chapter is just with a little bit of a tale about one of the dwarf slayers who had come out on a sortie to chase the Skaven down into the lower halls. And this slayer in this tale right here, he is called, better get his name right because he's an important fellow, he is called Aldrich the Scarred. And he is trundling around in the depths, chasing Skaven and trying to find his doom, as slayers do, against the biggest and nastiest thing that's possible. And he's down there for weeks, you know, just surviving and cutting, and he's injured and wounded. But the key important thing here is in Aldrich's travels, he comes into this huge, vast chamber, which is just a big old breeding pit for Skaven. And it's got all these breeding monsters that are chained to the floor, and they are literally pumping out thousands of Skaven, little whelplings, every day, pumping them out. And his eyes go wide, and he recognizes that, this is just impossible. Like, we're fighting outnumbered 20-1 upstairs right now, and then there's thousands and thousands more on the way within the next couple of days. Like, there's just no hope. So as he vows that he's going to make it back to the surface. And he's still another week or so before he gets anywhere close to recognizable halls again to get him back into the surface. And sadly, he comes to an ignominious end with a stealthy weeping blade between his shoulder blades, like a true Skaven assassin would, and puts an end to this brave dwarf who has been venturing on his own, slaying for weeks, thus not really getting the dreamy slayer oath that is deserving of a great slayer. So I guess what I come away from that tale with is just, again, the realization of hopelessness for the dwarves. And that kind of is a bit of a segue into this next little part. So maybe Keith, I can pass to you. You can tell us about the stance of the dwarfs right here as we realize that Belagar is actually still alive.
Yeah, so it's been months since Belagar has retreated back into his citadel, and so that's kind of destroying Queek's plans of a really quick, decisive victory to move on, which I guess for the dwarves, we'll put that as a 1 in the dwarf column, because they're really not getting a lot. So he's kind of getting his sat on, sitting in in the dark in his hall, and he's got his goblins and the ogres above him, and he's got the Skaven assaulting him from below. And the thing that's really worrying him is the ancient runes of protection, the runes of Valea, who is one of the dwarven ancestor gods of hearth and home and protection. They've started to fail, and they've never failed before. So this is kind of kind of going back to things that we saw in Blockkin and Kane, where we're talking about the Divine, and basically the good guys are not doing so hot. So the gates are not impenetrable anymore, and they're very likely to fall. But he receives a messenger from Thorgrim, and he says that no help is coming, and that another dwarf called Karak has been conquered by the Skaven, and that the king and the rune master, or the runesmith Karak Ironbrow, is dead. And he also says that there's a bunch of refugees heading towards Karak Eight Peaks, and the king asks that Belagar sends them aid. And a kind of a testament to the dwarf philosophy is that even though he's so hard pressed and he's so undermanned, he still sends a few rangers out, whatever he can do, to try and help them find safe passage. Either it's not really clear if you're going to take them into Eight Peaks or to help them get out again or anything like that. But it's at this point where we.
Oh, Keith, I think we lost your audio there for that last bit. If you had been muted. Yeah, just so where you left off is you were just saying that the state of things was that there were refugees on their way, and Belagar had still found a way to send out some rangers to see if he could help them to be guided in. And I think with the point that you made that I agree with is I think the motivation has got to be for him that he's trying his best to get people under his roof. I mean, even if they are refugees, they can probably swing an axe, and any dwarf that can swing an axe is worth a couple dozen Skaven at this point. So he's willing to take it, right? Okay. Well, so at that point, now that we see the state of the dwarfs, I want to kick it over to you, Vince, because we have a little bit of a exchange between a couple of Skaven clan lords here. If you're ready for that.
Absolutely, yeah. So we pick up with old Queek, the Headtaker, the warlord of Clan Moors, who is standing around, and he hears an approaching dignitary before he sees him, which I love, because of course who's coming to talk to him is Ikit Klaw. Ikit, which is obviously so has at the beginning of this book sort of fell from grace with Clan Skyer, but he's one of the greatest warp block engineers that's alive, and he is well known for having been nearly, shall we say, consumed by the flames of his own experimentation, and so he built himself like an exosuit to continue fighting that makes him stronger, faster. He's like the $6 million Skaven, and so he shambles up. And he sort of gets right up to Queek, and Queek says, basically in very short order, Queek's a very straightforward Skaven. He doesn't have what's held him back is he's a very impressive warrior, but he doesn't have any of the political acumen so many Skaven play around with. And he just says, why are you here? And he says, oh, well, I've brought you something. I've brought you something very special. These will do the job you need. And they don't really... So he doesn't really expound upon exactly what he's giving him, but he implies that this is sort of... He's handing him over the ultimate weapon in the coming battle against the dwarves. And very soon we'll see that play out to be, pretty true what he gives over there.
Well, why don't you carry on and take us through that part, the introduction of Skaven weaponry that's revealed in the next little clash against the dwarfs.
Absolutely. So what we've got is we pick up, and so we're sort of picking up at Karak Eight Peaks, and basically the realm is sort of shrinking, right? The dwarves are very adept at this, as are the Skaven. These are the two best tunnel fighting races, and so the dwarves give ground very grudgingly, and they're having to shrink their defenses just due to the overwhelming mass. The Skaven are, like you said, one good dwarf with an axe is probably worth 10 Skaven. The problem is that the Skaven are outnumbering the dwarves more than 10 to 1, so even if that ratio holds true, the dwarves still lose. And so Belegar is just pulling back and pulling back and pulling back and shrinking. And as they get to this sort of inner circle, it's sort of to a point where the dwarves can actually easily hold this territory, and they're at their ring of their innermost, strongest defenses. And they have all these, their quarrelers and stuff set up, and no matter how many bodies the Skaven send at them, their war machines and gunners and such are able to just mutilate them, right? Just absolutely blow them down. And that's when we get the introduction of the new weapon, which is, of course, the Skaven Stormfiend. A wicked combination of Clan Moulder and Clan Skyre's best technology. So this is a giant, even further mutated rat ogre, bulky enough to hold a Skaven sort of weapon. So this would be like the rattling guns and the warp fire throwers and things like that they used to take to a Skaven to trundle into battle with. They can hold multiples of them on their body simultaneously. And to help them think, they built a tiny little brain rat that's exposed that rides on the back of them and sort of steers him around to do the thinking. So the body is all just this big muscle machine that totes the weapon, while a tiny little Skaven brain thing drives him around on the back. And so this sick and twisted combination of beautiful Clan Skyre technology and Moulder modifications comes into the battle and just absolutely destroys the Dwarven lines. In very short order, they breach the defenses, they obliterate everybody there. And I think the best moment for me is when they talk about how, like, the rat ogres who have, like, the rattling guns are just machining dwarves down, and when they run out of standing dwarves, they just start machining the corpses, and then, like, the dead man switches go off, and they're still just, like, pulling the trigger, not understanding why they can't keep shooting, because it's all they want to do. They're literally just programmed to murder. And, like, one of them turns around and just starts trying to shoot clan rats because he doesn't care as long as he's killing.
Well, wasn't there a moment in here where his little brain rat that's on his back got shot up or something like that, or filled with a quarrel? So then the rat ogre just goes aimlessly and he starts spraying down clan rats and things. So,
exactly.
So,
he just starts shooting everybody, and the rest of Skaven are just like, whatever, it's fine. Just let him go. He'll hit the enemy half the time. It's close enough.
He'll come home when he's hungry. He's fine.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so this is another one of those battles where it's Skaven versus dwarfs. Dwarfs are trying to hold on, but of course they're forced to retreat further again under this new weaponry that's been shown off to them, further and further back into their citadel, where they're going to hole up. But at this point, Queek decides that there's something else that's a little more important than finishing off the dwarves, because they're pretty much done, and he's going to rely upon his masses of bodies to finally finish off the dwarves. So he turns his attention now to Skarsnik. So we discover that both of these two guys are still alive, even though that hall got caved in. As good heroes do, and major players in the Warhammer world, they still manage to scurry away and wriggle their way to safety somehow against all the odds. So effectively we just have this build-up to a big, giant staged fight out on the surface now between the Skaven and the goblins. So any key things throughout this grindy battle that were significant for you, Keith? Or Vince, either of you guys, if you want to pipe in.
Oh, we'll let Keith start it out. I've got a few notes, but sure, we'll let Keith start it out.
Okay, well, I think the main part is when Queek comes up and he sees a couple of goblins there, but he doesn't see Skarsnik, and there's not a lot going on. He's leading this attack personally, so he rushes in, starts wrecking them, and then Skarsnik, being the master of ambushes and guerrilla warfare, he pops up and spiders start coming over craters, and wyverns come down from the sky, and cave squigs are bouncing around, killing everything. So I thought it was pretty cool. It was reflective of Skarsnik's character. Like, he's never going to go on he's never going to engage in a head-on fight with anyone really. I mean, that's his MO, is to be sneaky. There's a little cool duel between Queek and a Black Orc war boss who's riding around on a wyvern, and just how the fight ends is so Queek is trying to find an opening, but the wyvern is just too fast and he can't get past the scales. So Queek comes up with this brilliant idea where he stabs the wyvern in the eye, and naturally the wyvern jerks straight up. But Queek anticipates this and uses the momentum to flip himself around, do a little pirouette, lock off the Black Orc's landing, or lock off the Black Orc's head, and then nails the landing for a perfect 10. So I thought that was pretty impressive.
You kind of envisioned Queek the gymnast?
Pretty much. He would have taken gold for me. I mean, it was... Yeah, and I just imagine that, I forget the weapon's name now, but the little pick dwarf poker or slayer, whatever it's called, it's got the little ribbon. Yeah, dwarf dagger. It's got the little ribbon for the floor gymnastics as well. And that's quite graceful.
Yeah, sure enough.
Yeah. And then, of course, you've got the intervention of the Vermin Lord Lurklox. But I'll let Vince take this because he likes all things.
Yeah, so Vince, after Keith has just kind of summed up as far as Queek getting into the challenge with the wyvern riding and taking him out there. What else
I
you got?
agree. I mean, if you look at Queek's fig, he is totally an acrobat, right? Like the model itself, he's way up in the air, like leaping. Yeah, this dude, he's like he's Batroc the Leaper over here. You can't stop that guy. He's going forward all the time. That's Queek Headtaker.
Good. So what else was key moments in that battle for you?
I like that we got to see an Arachnarok, and I like that the Deceiver was so effective. The Deceiver is one of my favorites of the Vermin Lords, and I think you saw he shows up, and he's so tide turning in this fight and so potent. I love the use of the big warp star. I mean, he's a fun guy. And he's like this little schemer. You know, Eshin is always one of the most fun, and this is like the super patron of the Eshin, right? And you get a nice scene with him right after the fight as well, basically once the tide is turned. But you also get a really rare moment at the end after the battle is sort of won, that you learn how, like, Queek, if you see his fig, he's very clean and fastidious. Like, people always paint him very clean. He's never dirty. And they actually show you how he achieves that by, you know, having a horde of his servant rats come up to him after the fight, take his armor off of him, and then lick him clean and like gnaw the chunks of dwarf flesh out of his and mats out of his fur, and then lick his armor clean and then put it back on him. Like, man, that is, I don't know if that's like the best job you could have in his army or the worst job. After the battle, you have to lick the warlord clean. Boy, it's a rough life in North sometimes.
Can any of you tell me that if you were a warlord of any sort at all, that you wouldn't appreciate having a crowd of people to do that for you?
I guess it depends on the makeup of that crowd. That would be my answer to the question.
Yeah, indeed. Well, so this Vermin Lord that you make mention of, he names himself as Lurklox, and we had a quick introduction to him real early on, actually, where he revealed himself to Queek as his patron, just as Soothnar was the patron to Kranskrit, the Greyseer. So what happens at this point is once again after the Vermin Lord reveals himself and wreaks a terrific amount of havoc on spiders and goblins alike, Queek presses the advantage that he has and makes sure that all the Skaven go away and that the cave squigs retreat. So that kind of brings the battle to a close. But I think we're gonna come back in for a minute before we change venues and talk about that exchange afterwards between Lurklox and Queek. Vince, you wanna handle that one too?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. He comes up right as Queek is being licked clean, and he's like, yes, good, preening, yes, good little warlord. And I would just point out that when you see a lot of these interactions, the elder vermin lords take this very like almost parental attitude towards the leaders of the Skaven. Like we're going to see that again later in this chapter, where they really do almost have this like little, like you would pat a parent, or maybe like you would pat a pet. That's probably more appropriate, like a master to a pet, right? Relationship. So, and Queek, of course, doesn't like the way that Lurklocks, that the vermin, or that the deceiver is talking to him, because he's truly a very arrogant warlord, even by Skaven standards. And he says, basically in short order, look, I cut a deal. I went to Skarsnik, and this is the deceiver talking, and I cut a deal. They'll go away if you bring them the head. So, you know, bring us the head of the Dwarf King, and the goblins won't bother you anymore. So he pulls this little sort of backdoor shady deal that Queek would have clearly never done. Like, that's way outside of Queek's purview, but it's certainly well within the deal of the shady sort of Eshin patron to always be back dealing. And so he basically sets that up. And so there's two setups here. So he says, Queek says, what did you give promise Skarsnik? And the Vermin Lord says, the promise of that head and something Ikit Klaw does not yet know is missing. So there's kind of another little piece being set up there of what we're about, well, something else that we don't know yet.
Yeah, so this is another thing that this book becomes famous for, is leaving you with little cliffhangers or foreshadowing or foreboding of something to come. So we kind of all have to keep that in our minds, that there's some, again, internal Skaven shenanigans going on where they're trying to sabotage one another. And in this case, the victim appears to be Ikit Klaw, which is in fact the segue to take us to a different theater of war now. So we're going to travel north up the road and leave Karak Eight Peaks for the first time, and get to the Slayer Keep of Karak Kadrin. So Keith, you have this is an opportunity for you for some input. We haven't heard you for a little bit. You want to? All
right. Well, I want to start this bit off with, it's not important to the overall story at all, but I thought it was a great little aside where Ikit Klaw was marching north to Karak Kadrin, which is the dwarf Slayer hold. And along the way, he's traveling through the Under Empire, which is a bunch of tunnels, and they're basically like highways. And even though he's got the right of way, a bunch of other warlords are moving in his way, and they're slowing him down, and he's pretty annoyed by this. So what does he do? He fills the tunnel to capacity with doom wheels and just like goes right over them, turns them to paste, which I thought was fantastic.
Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, I love the recklessness of Ikit Klaw driving doom wheels down the underway.
Definitely, guy just he had to go somewhere, and they were in his way, so he ran over them, and that was fantastic. I just had the idea of like doom wheels trying to drag race through tunnels. It was great. So anyway, he eventually makes it to Karak Kadrin, and the Skaven have been sieging it for like almost a year. And this is a bit different from the other dwarf holds, because normally when you think of besieging dwarves, they just kind of sit in their mountains and they shoot you with their quarrelers and their handguns and their war machines, and they don't budge. But with this being a Slayer hold, King Ungrim, he is a kind of a fiery hothead, and he makes a lot of sorties. So the Skaven are kind of like pushed back on the defensive quite a bit. But Ikit Klaw shows up, and he's like, okay, I've got a plan. Here's what we're going to do. And he starts unloading all of his clan scryer kit. And then he notices something called the Warp Bomb Magnifier was missing. And this is, could be alluding to the other thing that Lurklocks had promised to Skarsnik earlier. But apparently this was like the biggest bomb that he had ever made that would have made a Doom rocket look like a firecracker. But it's gone. And so he's a bit upset by this, but being the industrious little rat that he is, he presses on and goes, okay, new project, new plan. Now, he wants to crack this place quickly because he's still really annoyed that he got kicked off the Destroying the Moon project, which was given to his protege, and he thinks that his place within Clan Scryer is going to be overtaken by this guy. So essentially what he wants to do is erect this massive gun platform outside of the Skaven Mountain that's facing the front of the dwarf hold, load it up with dwarf cannons, just bombard the side of the mountain, and then lob poisonous gas inside. Which sounds like a great plan. And this gas is like Ikit's new favorite thing, and it's like apparently way more potent than anything Clan Castilians has ever cooked up, which is saying something. Yes, Kieran.
I wanted to interject with something again that's Skaven-y character-wise that I thought was cool about what Ikit does here in the opening. So he comes into the war room once he gets to the staging area, right? And everybody's looking nervous and like, oh, this guy's going to take over and he's going to bump us off. And he takes a few moments to sort of calm him down and say, no, it's okay. But I do need to hear from you all. I need to see. You need to tell me what's going on here. What's the staging area like? What's worked so far? What kind of forces the dwarf have? What are their positions of their war machines, etc., etc. And so once he gets that from all the warlords, well, then he lights them on fire, and then he just flames them all. He's like, I got what you need. Got what I need from you. Now I'll dispose of you after I've made you feel relaxed for 20 seconds, and now you're done.
Well, he had to put up with them for all of moments. I mean, that would be really frustrating for him. I can understand that.
That's a lot of restraint for a Skaven, I'm sure.
Yeah. Especially one guy who like packs a war fire thrower in his hand.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Vince, maybe we'll get you involved from here. So, Ikit's revealed his plan that he's discovered he's missing that vital piece. Sorry, what was the name of it, Keith? The piece that
it's the warp bomb magnifier.
The warp bomb magnifier. Yeah, so he discovers he's missing that. But he comes up with another plan to bombard from this, and I think it was 3 miles away down the pass is where they have this staging area. So maybe we can turn it back to Vince, and you can let us in on how this sort of all pans out from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to talk about that bomb, you're like the size of that bomb is truly what I love. He planned to blow up the whole mountain with it. That should show you, like Ikit Klaw, creator of the Doom Wheel, when he makes the most explosive thing he's ever made, that's real explosive. And so he's talking to Throt. So Throt the Unclean, who's like this sort of mildly famous 3-armed guy who is a packmaster. And they're saying, like, okay, what are we going to do? We're not going to get in. They still hold the heights. They still have their war machines. What are we going to do? And he says, well, we need a distractionary force. I need you to bring up your 3 hell pits. Because Throt has 3 hell pit abominations. And as anybody who's ever sat on the table knows, 1 hell pit is tough, 2 hell pits is outright filthy. I can't imagine 3. And so clearly this is a grand army. And so he has these 3 things, and he says, bring them up, and I need those abominations, and they need to carry 1 extra thing into battle. So once again, we have this setup of like another cliffhanger, right, of what's going to happen. And, very quickly, sort of the battle is joined. And what I like about this section, so we've got old Ungrim, right, who's our dwarven sort of character on the other side of this, the Slayer King. And there's a line that sort of starts this little section where it says, Ungrim Ironfist was angry. In truth, he was always angry, but the year-long siege had rendered his temper white-hot. So that's interesting because, 1, you get a nice timestamp there of that this has been going on for a year, right, of this siege. And 2, I just love that it's very Slayery, right? He's always angry, but now, like, just everywhere he looks, he sees rats, and he's like, oh, you can picture him just walking around, like, oh, he just wants to kill something so bad because he's a Slayer. He's just permanently pissed. So, basically, the battle itself is pretty straightforward. they, I mean, there's the standard back and forth sort of fighting here we see in a lot of this stuff, right? And the Skaven use a distraction force, and then the dwarves come in, but sort of Ikit's plan is kind of going Ikit's plan is sort of going exactly how he thought it would. The dwarves kind of push out, but then basically things turn against them. They have to sound the call to retreat, and as they're retreating back to the doors, that's when Ikit actually unleashes the true thing. So his distractionary force has done its job, and now he sends out these 3 abominations that we were promised earlier. And the 3 of them just march forward, and it explains that they are withstanding a hail of fire that an army couldn't withstand, right? They're getting hit by grudge throwers and cannons and fusillades of quarrelers and just on and on and on. And one of them falls, and then the 2 of them make it to the door, and they start banging in the door, and finally, like, one of them beats the door down or gets in and kind of squeezes its way through like a rat can, even though it's this huge bag of like heads and limbs and everything, and it squeezes its way through, and then it dies to the initial thing. And then, so there's one in and one right there at the door, still alive. And you see Queek pressing his red button, and basically we get a recreation of the scene from The Dark Knight, where the Joker is like, boop, 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 and nothing happens, and he like takes it and shakes it, and he's like, huh. And then, boop, and yeah, we get a nice big bomb as what remained of the gates are blown off their hinges as a bomb detonation sends toxic clouds bellowing into the heart of the Death Peak.
Yeah. So we really got to lay the gravity of the situation of what just happened there. But there's also one other thing that I want to interject about Ungrim too, before we do that, and that is that during that battle, again, as you said, Vince, there's not a lot of great happenings that go on. I mean, it's your usual Skaven versus dwarf grind, but the storm feeds do present themselves again, and they bring out the warp fire contingent of it, and one guy lights up Ungrim, but he turtles underneath his dragon cloak, and there's this sort of cinematic moment where all the dwarfs stop what they're doing. They stop hacking dwarfs. Well, rather, the dwarfs stop hacking Skaven, and the Skaven stop hacking dwarfs for a moment, while they wonder what the hell just happened. And stepping out of the crater comes Ungrim, and he throws his cloak back, his dragon cloak, and he's protected from the fire, and he just slices that rat ogre in twain, and the dwarfs go, yay! Let's keep hacking. Let's keep slicing. And that was right at the moment where, just very shortly after that, Ungrim's spidey senses start to tingle, and he realizes that maybe he's been drawn out too far. And that's, as far as the timing goes, that's where, as you said, the hell pits are unleashed to go and assault the gates. But again, the gravity of what is in those hell pits and what they packed inside them was the big gas bombs, and apparently it only took one to just go off and fill the whole upper level of Karak Eight when that thing blew up. And that's kind of where they leave that scene of Karak Eight. It was a pretty quick scene. But then we flip it back to another scene in a different dwarf hold, and this is where Mr. Thorgrim Grudgebearer, the High King of the Dwarfs, is at. So, Keith, are you a fan of anything that happened in this battle of Karak Eight before we move on to that?
The only other thing I'd point out is, as I mentioned before, is the runes of Alea are also failing on in the Slayer holds. So clearly, it's some sort of universal thing that the dwarf gods are failing them, or their ancestor runes are not working anymore. And I think this is kind of harking back to the War of the Gods stuff that was going on in King. But I'm not that well up on dwarf lore and the significance of their gods and what they did and why. So if either of you guys know anything more about Valea or why those runes failing might be significant, or even if any of the viewers knew and wanted to leave it in the comments.
Yeah, I could speak to that.
Yeah.
Well, Valea is the dwarf god of hearth and home, So she's sort of their protectress, if you will. In Warhammer game terms, she's the one that is always related to when you talk about runes of spell breaking and that kind of thing. And in fact, they have in game terms, they have a great banner of Valea, which gives them super magic resistance, that kind of thing. So she's the protectress. Now, what harkens back to that in the end time story, if you remember back to Nagash, where Neferata has that battle of the Underway against Thorek, that's where they get to the Chamber of Valaya, and it's, again, a cliffhanger at that point. They don't spell it out for you, but the impression they leave you with is the fact that they have effectively desecrated that shrine to Valaya, and her power is lost. So I think that's what we're getting to here in that segment of things. Okay. So in closing out the chapter here, maybe if you wanna pick it up from there, Keith, and let us know about, again, the perspective of the dwarfs from how Thorgrim Grudgebearer sees it.
So Thorgrim,
there might be one other thing we want to mention in there too.
Oh, sure, Vince, good. Jump in.
Yeah, I was gonna say, right before Thorgrim, you have Thorgrim Grudgebearer at Karaz Karak, but you've got Karak Eight Peaks and Belagor and that little scene happening as well, where we get the payoff of our earlier bargain being struck, right? And we get a true and glorious moment in the history of the Skaven. It's a very quick little scene, but in short order, Queek lives up to his end of the bargain. He fights his way in, having broken the defenses of Eight Peaks, gets his way to the center, and collects Belagar's head. The Headtaker takes another head.
Yeah, a good prize for his trophy rack. Yeah, I guess I'm sorry I mixed up the sequencing of there, but you're very right in that we have that happen before we get to Thorgrim's action.
Yeah, it's a very short scene. It's kind of funny because it's even in the text they reference it being kind of anticlimactic, right? That the fight was fairly one-sided. Like Queek gets on him and more or less does what Queek does to dwarves and takes his skull.
Yeah. Well, he was worn out by that point. Poor old Belagar. Been through a lot.
Yeah, Queek used hundreds and hundreds of rats attacking him for hours. They actually say that, like, he figured he would need to wear Belagar down for 8 hours before he joined the fray, and he only made it half that time.
Okay. Well, so sorry I was a little out of sequence there, but thanks for stepping in, Vince. Keith, you want to take us through the dwarf end of things, and then maybe we'll come back to Vince to tell us about this little final little sidebar at the end of the chapter.
Okay, so yeah, we kick it to the High King Thorgrim, Grudgebearer, and he's situated in Karaz Karak, which is also under siege by the Skaven, of course. And like at this point, he's realized that this isn't just another random attack by the Skaven. This is a calculated campaign to totally annihilate the dwarf race and to kind of solidify the Skaven as the masters of the underworld. And then they would have like unchecked reign of moving through all those tunnels across the world. So at this point, 4 other dwarf cults have been destroyed, and it gives us again one of those really nice timestamps and puts a lot of the happenings in the wider world in perspective. So Thorgrim is kind of reflecting on how Tilia and Estalia have collapsed years ago to the Skaven, and that Britonia is now overrun by the Skaven. The Empire of Man is in disarray because at this point Karl Franz is either dead or missing, so we know it's before that point when he returns in Glotkin, and that Nagash has returned, so the dead are stirring, and then the Chaos are marching, and the Elves are fighting each other. So the world is just in chaos. But being a dwarf, he's solid, and he's content to return to his mountain, and he trusts in the strength of that. So Karaz Karak is kind of like the heart of the dwarf race, and it's withstood a lot in the past, and he's confident that as long as Karaz Karak can endure, the dwarf race can endure as a whole. And so he returns to the mountain to spend endless hours meeting with his advisors. But before he goes, he touches the rune of eternity, which is on his throne, and it's still nice and warm. So you kind of get this image that there's still hope for the dwarves. Like as long as, even though the runes of Alea are failing and the dwarf holes are collapsing, as long as that rune of eternity is still going, you know, everything still might be okay for the dwarves. The race might still survive.
Yeah, I agree with you. That closing little bit where he touches the rune of eternity on his throne is sort of that one little shred that gives you hope for the dwarfs after what has been, let's admit it, a pretty freaking bleak time against overwhelming pressures all this way through these last two chapters. And maybe, you know what? Let's just have a quick thought about how you feel about the dwarfs before we close this out. So Vince, what's your feelings about the dwarfs past and future after these two chapters?
They're getting exactly what they deserve. They're a sad race full of sad, short, little angry people who are always talking about how they're a dying race and their time has ended, and they're very like downtrodden. They have that perception that they're on the way out, right? That kind of colors the whole race. And the way I see it, the Skaven are just giving them what they wanted here. Like, they've been talking about how they're fading from the world for so long or whatever. And, well, guess what? You worship death for so long and you make a whole cult dedicated to seeking death? Well, it's eventually going to find you, buddy. And now it's time to pay the piper on that little bargain. I see this as no great loss to the world. This is just this is a victory a long time promised and well earned.
Well, do you feel like that they at least are going down with a good fight, Keith?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's this really great comparison earlier on in the chapter where the Stormpedes make their appearance, and it says, you know, oh, the Skaven are crazy and inventive, and that's where they come up with these like really weird abominations. And so even if it fails 99 times, that one time out of 100, something great happens, and you get, you know, Stormpedes and innovation. And the exact opposite of that are the dwarves, who are very conservative and very refined, and they will just practice something over and over and over and over again to absolute perfection, and that comes out in their armor and their weapons and their rune sniffing and things like that. So I think the outcome is inevitable, but I don't think they're going out without a fight. I mean, what's the most characteristic trait you can think of a dwarf? It's stubborn, right? They will not give up till the very last man, and I think we're definitely going to see that in the future.
Well, yeah, that's a good comparison, actually, that in their craftsmanship and their attitudes about the things that they build, the Skaven and the dwarfs are so very opposite that, well, I guess in this story where chaos seems to be the driver behind all things, it seems that this is another example of chaos outlasting order in a lot of ways. Right. Okay. So without unless you have any more final thoughts about the dwarfs, let's leave off, Vince, with our last little sidebar segue that goes on here, and we get to see an important guy at play.
Absolutely. So Thanquol, hey, the namesake of the book shows back up, and we pick up with him stewing in the sewers of Nuln. He's deep underneath Nuln, which, if we all remember, is the artillery capital, as it were, of the Empire, right? Famous for the gunnery school, and they're the makers of all the war machines and cannons and stuff like that. The artillery train of Nuln. And, you know, this has long been a crown jewel in the Empire, and something that really allows them to defend the realm. Like, this is a huge amount of technology that the Skaven want, and B, the supplying of this artillery to the rest of the Empire is, you know, what really gives the Empire a lot of its strength. You take away all their guns, and what do they got? They've got a bunch of weak humans with bad swords. So getting rid of Nuln is high on Thanquol's list. He knows this would be a great thing for him. But when we start out, he's a little depressed because his plans have, you know, sort of all fallen through. And that's when a light appears in the darkness of the tunnels, and that is where we meet old Screech Vermin King. So they're one of the named or very high up, sort of very potent vermin lords. And you get the impression that the other vermin lords, that there are other vermin lords as well. They're kind of watching him from the darkness. And Screech basically says, don't worry, we have a plan, and we're going to take care of you. You're going to do just fine. And this is where that thing comes in again. He actually pats he pats Thanquol on the head, like patting his horns, which are famously like these warpstone chunks horns. He pats him on the head, and he's like, there. It'll be fine. We're going to get this all taken care of. And together we shall conquer, right? And so it sort of sets up that the Vermin Lords are backing Thanquol in this play for Nuln.
So everybody's getting a Vermin Lord patron, is what we've discovered here. That's what we're learning about this.
Absolutely. Everybody's got a giant demon rat behind them.
Yeah, and that obviously bodes pretty well for a Skaven if you're of that race.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, you guys have any other final thoughts or key moments you want to share about chapters 2 or 3 before we close it out? Favorite guy in this chapter? Anybody want to say they love a dwarf? No, I didn't think so. All the crickets are going off. Those poor dwarfs. Don't even have a friend in death.
No.
All right.
My only thought is that, you made mention of this earlier, but since we just kind of closed on him, I'll say it. Not a lot of Thanquol in Thanquol. You know what I mean? Like, I'm sure we'll mention it again, but boy, does he not get enough screen time. Like, in these 2 chapters are more, other than this, more or less Thanquol-less.
Yeah, I mean, the last time that we saw Thanquol was in the prologue, right? Where he was messing around with the Grey Seers on the Pull the Moon Towards It project, and then he worked his way into sabotaging that with some work with Clanessian, right? And then here he is again, 3 chapters later.
Yeah.
I'm sure we'll see more of him. So on that note, we'll close it out this session, and then we're going to resume next one down the road. It'll be chapter 4 of the Thanquol. So thanks again.
The bell tolls for Nuln.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, farewell, gents, to the both of you, and farewell to the viewers. We'll resume again next time for more of the end times.